The silence in the king's study was a physical thing, a weight of centuries pressed into the velvet curtains and the ancient, worn leather of the chairs. It was a silence composed of dust motes dancing in the slivers of moonlight, of the scent of old paper and beeswax, of the slow, soundless beat of a heart that had not needed to race in 100 years. King Caelan of the Vesperine court sat behind a desk carved from the heartwood of a petrified forest, the dark grain swirling like trapped smoke beneath his fingertips. His stillness was absolute, a predator's economy of motion that had become the habit of a monarch. Outside, his kingdom of perpetual twilight hummed with the ceaseless, quiet machinations of the undying, but here, in this sanctum, only time itself seemed to move, and it did so with grudging slowness. For 600 years, he had ruled. He had seen empires of men rise from dust and return to it. He had known passion that burned like a fever and grief that froze the soul, and he had learned to master both, to pack them away like old robes in a cedar chest, things to be remembered but no longer worn. His existence was a long, unbroken line of duty, of ritual, of the immense and crushing loneliness of being the single point upon which an entire civilization balanced. There were no surprises left. The world, both mortal and immortal, had exhausted its ability to startle him. Until the letter. It had arrived with the dusk delivery, a single, unassuming square of parchment tucked between a territorial treaty from the Southern Coven and a request for dispensation from a lesser lord. It bore no seal of wax, no house sigil, only a return address in a mortal village so insignificant he had to summon a map from memory to place it, a cluster of cottages huddled by a river on the very edge of his domain, a place of wood smoke and sheep and short, brutish lives. The script was human, feminine, a series of careful, looping letters that spoke of a hand unaccustomed to writing anything of importance. He had almost discarded it. He had a coterie of secretaries to filter such trifles. But something in the stark simplicity of it, the sheer audacity of a mortal sending a personal correspondence to the obsidian throne, had stayed his hand. He had slit it open with a silver letter opener, the edge whispering as it cut the fold. The words were few, written in faded brown ink. They were not a plea for aid or a curse from a wronged villager. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the blunt terror of someone who had run out of all other options. To the king, it began, the honorific stark and unadorned. 18 months ago, on the night of the Red Harvest Festival in Oak Haven, we met. I do not expect you to remember me. It was one night. But a night can be enough. I write to you now not for myself, but because I have no other choice. You have a son. His name is Liam. He is half of you, half of me, and the world is not a safe place for what he is. I ask for nothing but that you know he exists. There was no signature. Only the truth, laid bare and terrible. Caelan read the words once. Then a second time. The silence in the room deepened, thickened, became a roaring in his ears. 18 months. The Red Harvest. He remembered it, a blur of firelight and rustic music, a rare excursion among the mortals whose lives fueled his kingdom. He remembered the press of the crowd, the scent of wine and roasting meat, the brief, intoxicating illusion of being someone else, someone without a crown. And he remembered a woman. He could not recall her name, but he remembered the feel of her hand in his, the startling warmth of her skin, the way her laughter had cut through the centuries of silence in his own soul. He remembered her eyes, the color of moss after a rain, filled not with the fear or awe he usually saw, but with a frank, uncomplicated curiosity. It had been a moment of madness, a reckless indulgence in a life that permitted none. An impulse. A forgetting. He had left before the dawn, a ghost slipping back into the shadows, the memory already fading, filed away with 1,000 other fleeting encounters. He had never considered the consequences, because for him, there had never been any. Vampires did not procreate with humans. It was a biological impossibility, a law of nature as immutable as the rising of the sun he could no longer witness. It was a child's fairy tale, a myth told to frighten both races. Yet the letter lay on his desk, the parchment absorbing the cool, dry air of the study. A son. The word was alien. It had no place in his vocabulary, no anchor in his reality. He was a king, a warrior, a creature of the night. He was not a father. He rose from the desk, the movement so fluid it was as if he had simply unwound from the chair. He paced the length of the room, his boots making no sound on the ancient rug. The portraits of his ancestors watched him from the walls, their painted eyes cold and judging. They were a long, unbroken line of pureblood rulers, their faces pale and severe, their legacy a burden of stone he carried every night. What would they think of this abomination? This impossibility? His mind, usually a fortress of logic and control, was a maelstrom. It could be a trick, a desperate mortal's ploy for gold or station. It was the most likely explanation. And yet, the simplicity of the letter argued against it. There were no demands, no threats. I ask for nothing but that you know he exists. It was a message sent into the void, a final act of a mother's hope or despair. He stopped before the tall, arched window. The glass was spun with threads of obsidian, distorting the moonlight, making the world outside a landscape of silver and shadow. He saw his own reflection, the pale, sculpted face, the dark hair that fell across his brow, the eyes that held the flat, depthless black of a starless night sky. He saw a king. But for the first time in centuries, a tremor of uncertainty ran through him, a crack in the marble facade of his composure. A son. He touched a hand to the cold glass, his fingers splayed. The physical world felt thin, unreal. The letter on his desk felt more solid than the stone castle around him. It was an anchor, pulling him down into a new and terrifying reality. The long, unbroken line of his existence had just been violently interrupted. Ilara knelt by the hearth, feeding small sticks into the embers. The fire was the only real source of light and warmth in their small, two-room cottage, its flickering orange glow pushing back the damp chill that seeped in from the river mists. Outside, the village of Oakhaven was asleep, a collection of dark, lumpy shapes under a blanket of stars. Here, inside, her world was small and centered entirely on the sleeping form in the cradle nearby. Liam. Her son. He slept with a stillness that was not entirely human. His chest rose and fell with a slow, even rhythm, his breathing almost silent. Even in sleep, his face, framed by a cap of dark, silky hair, held a strange and solemn beauty. His skin was pale, not with the milkiness of a human baby, but with the translucent quality of alabaster. He was 18 months old, but he had the quiet, watchful eyes of an old soul. He rarely cried. When he was hungry, he would simply watch her, his gaze intense and unwavering, until she understood. When he was hurt, a small scrape from a fall, he would look at the welling blood with a detached curiosity, his expression unreadable, before the skin knitted itself back together with unnatural speed. She lived in a state of constant, low-grade terror, a fear that was a cold knot in her stomach from the moment she woke to the moment she fell into an exhausted sleep. Every villager's glance felt like a judgment. Every time the elder's wife commented on how Liam never seemed to get sick, how his eyes were too dark, too knowing, for a child his age, Ilara's heart would hammer against her ribs. They were simple people, and they feared what they did not understand. And no one, least of all she, understood Liam. She knew who his father was. She knew it with a certainty that defied all logic. She had only to look at her son's face in the moonlight, at the aristocratic line of his jaw, the nascent intensity in his gaze, to see the ghost of the stranger from the Red Harvest Festival. He had called himself Kaelin, a name that had sounded like music. He had moved with a grace that was not of her world, his voice a low thrum that had vibrated through her very bones. In the chaos of the festival, surrounded by the loud, rough familiarity of her own people, he had been a figure of impossible calm and elegance. He had looked at her, and for the first time in her life, she had felt truly seen. She had not been afraid of him. That was the strangest part. His hands were cool, his presence overwhelming, but in his eyes, she had seen a loneliness so vast and ancient it had called to the quiet solitude of her own heart. For one night, she had not been Ilara the weaver's daughter, destined to marry a farmer and raise a brood of dirt-strewn children. She had been someone else, someone who could stand beside a king and not feel small. The morning had brought the cold, hard reality. He was gone. And she was left with a memory that felt more real than her own life. Then, weeks later, the impossible truth had taken root in her womb. A child. A child who, by all rights, should not exist. For 18 months, she had hidden him. She kept him indoors, made excuses for his pallor, deflected questions about his unnatural quiet. But he was growing. His differences were becoming more pronounced. Last week, a stray dog had snapped at him in the lane. Liam had not flinched. He had simply held out a small hand, and the dog, whining, had backed away, its tail between its legs, a strange terror in its eyes. A neighbor had seen. The whispers had started that evening. Unnatural. Witch child. Cursed. The letter had been her last resort. She had spent a week composing it, her hand shaking so badly the first few attempts were illegible. What could she say? How could she explain? In the end, she had settled on the simple, unvarnished truth. She hadn't asked for gold or a place at his side. She knew what he was. She knew the chasm that separated their worlds. She had asked only for him to know, a desperate hope that a king, a father, would not abandon his own blood to the superstitious cruelty of a small village. She had given the letter to a traveling merchant, along with the last of her silver coins, and prayed to gods she no longer believed in that it would find its way to him. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks of agonizing silence, of waiting for a knock on the door that could mean either salvation or doom. Every night, the fear grew sharper. The whispers in the village were getting louder. The glances were no longer just curious, they were hostile. She looked at Liam, his small face so peaceful in the firelight. A wave of love so fierce it was painful washed over her. He was her son. Her impossible, beautiful, terrifying son. She would burn the world down to keep him safe. But her world was this small cottage, and the fire in her hearth was dying. She had thrown her desperate message into the eternal night of his kingdom. Now, all she could do was wait in the dark, and pray he was the man she remembered, and not the monster of the stories. The reply came not as a letter, but as a presence. It arrived 5 days later, on a moonless night when the river fog was so thick it swallowed the world. Ilara had been darning one of Liam's small shirts by candlelight, the rhythmic push and pull of the needle a small anchor in the sea of her anxiety. Liam was asleep in his cradle. A sudden, profound silence fell over the night. The crickets stopped chirping. The wind died in the trees. It was a stillness that felt heavy, watchful. A knock came at her door. It was not a loud, demanding rap, but a soft, deliberate sound. 3 distinct taps. Her heart leaped into her throat. It felt as if the sound had come from inside her own chest. She froze, the needle falling from her numb fingers. It couldn't be villagers. Their knocks were clumsy, impatient. This was something else. Slowly, she rose. She moved to the cradle, her body a shield between her son and the door. "Who is it?" she called out, her voice a thin, reedy thing. There was a pause. Then a voice, low and resonant, a voice she had heard only once but had relived in her dreams 1,000 times, answered from the other side of the oak door. "You know who it is. Kaelin." The breath left her body in a rush. He was here. Not an emissary, not a squad of guards. The king himself stood on her doorstep. Terror and a wild, inexplicable relief warred within her. She had wanted him to know, but she had never imagined this. Her hand trembled as she reached for the iron latch. The wood of the door felt cold, a final, flimsy barrier between her small, fragile life and the immense, ancient power that waited outside. She lifted the latch. The door swung inward on creaking hinges, pulling the thick fog into the cottage in a swirling, ghostly tide. He stood on the threshold, a figure carved from shadow and moonlight. He was dressed not in royal finery but in simple, dark traveling clothes, a high-collared coat that did little to conceal the aura of absolute authority that clung to him like a shroud. He was exactly as she remembered, yet infinitely more real, more dangerous. His face was pale and perfect, his dark eyes holding an unnerving depth. They swept the room in a single, comprehensive glance, taking in the sparse furniture, the dying fire, the sleeping child in the cradle, before finally settling on her. "Ilara," he said. Her name on his lips was a strange intimacy, a confirmation that he did, in fact, remember. She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. She clutched the fabric of her dress, her knuckles white. His gaze shifted from her to the cradle. He took a single step into the cottage, his movement silent and fluid. The space seemed to shrink around him, the low-beamed ceiling suddenly oppressive. He was a creature of vast, open halls and soaring spires, and here, in her humble home, he was an overwhelming, breathtaking presence. He moved towards the cradle, and a primal, protective instinct surged through Ilara. She stepped into his path, her body a weak and trembling barricade. "Please," she whispered. "Don't." Kaelin stopped. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable. There was no anger in his eyes, but there was an intensity that felt like a physical force. "I have not come to harm him," he said, his voice quiet, yet it filled the small room. "I have come to see. To see the proof. To see the impossibility made flesh." Ilara held his gaze for a long moment, searching for any sign of malice, of revulsion. She saw only a vast, glacial stillness, a control so absolute it was terrifying. Slowly, reluctantly, she stepped aside. He moved to the cradle and looked down. For a long, stretched-out eternity, he did not move, did not breathe. He simply stood over the sleeping child, a dark, silent statue. Ilara watched his face, her own breath caught in her chest. She saw a flicker of something in the depths of his eyes, disbelief, wonder, a strange, possessive darkness. He saw the child's pale skin, the fine, dark hair, the subtle, sharp line of his cheekbones that so perfectly mirrored his own. He saw the truth. As if sensing the immense presence looming over him, Liam stirred. His eyes fluttered open. They were not the hazy, unfocused eyes of a human toddler waking from sleep. They were Kaelin's eyes, chips of obsidian, ancient and aware. The child did not cry or show fear. He simply looked up at the king, a silent, solemn regard passing between father and son. Kaelin's control finally fractured. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath hissed between his teeth. He reached out a hand, his long, pale fingers trembling almost imperceptibly, and gently, so gently, brushed a stray lock of hair from the child's forehead. The contact was brief, a ghost of a touch, but it was a confession. It was an acknowledgement. He drew his hand back as if burned and turned to Ilara. The mask of the king was back in place, but she had seen the crack. She knew. "He is mine," Kaelin stated. It was not a question. It was a proclamation, a claiming. The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of destiny. "You will both come with me. You are not safe here." The journey to the Citadel of Night was a passage into another world. They traveled in a carriage of black, unadorned lacquer, drawn by two horses the color of coal that moved with a silent, tireless gait. Kaelin rode with them, sitting opposite Ilara, the space between them charged with unspoken things. Liam, for his part, was calm, sitting on his mother's lap and watching the alien landscape slide past the window with wide, curious eyes. He did not seem to fear the king. In fact, a strange, silent communication seemed to exist between them. Kaelin would look at the child, a question in his dark gaze, and Liam would offer a small, solemn nod, as if in understanding. It was unnerving and, for Ilara, profoundly isolating. She was the bridge between their two worlds, yet she felt stranded, belonging to neither. She watched Kaelin as he watched their son. She saw the king, the ruler, assessing the political implications of this impossible child. She saw the predator, marveling at this new and unique form of life. But beneath it all, she saw something else, something hesitant and new. A flicker of bewildered tenderness. A man grappling with an emotion for which his long life had left him completely unprepared. They left the green, rolling hills of the mortal lands behind, entering a realm of jagged black mountains that clawed at a sky of permanent twilight. The air grew colder, thinner, scented with pine and cold stone. The citadel itself rose from the highest peak, a breathtaking and terrifying structure of obsidian and silver, its towers and spires seeming to pierce the bruised purple clouds. It was not a place of warmth or welcome. It was a fortress, a declaration of power, a monument to eternity and solitude. As the carriage passed through the great gates and into a vast, torchlit courtyard, Ilara clutched Liam tighter. The air hummed with a silent, predatory energy. Figures moved in the shadows, their forms graceful, their faces pale and beautiful, their eyes glinting with a curiosity that was sharp and hungry. They were Kaelin's court, his people. And she and her son were alien things, brought into the heart of their world. They were led not to a dungeon, but to a suite of rooms high in one of the citadel's towers. The chambers were opulent, furnished with dark, heavy woods, rich velvets, and silver ornaments that gleamed in the soft, magical light of floating crystal lamps. A fire had been laid in the hearth, its flames casting a warm, dancing glow that felt like a deliberate, almost desperate, attempt at welcome. A large window looked out over the sprawling kingdom of night, a vista of shadowed mountains and distant, flickering lights under a canopy of brilliant, cold stars. It was beautiful, but it was the beauty of a gilded cage. "You will be safe here," Kaelan said, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. He stood by the door, not fully entering her new space, maintaining a careful distance. "No one will harm you," it was a promise, and a command. Ilara set Liam down, and the child, unbothered by the sudden change in surroundings, immediately toddled towards the window, pressing his small hands against the cool glass to look out at the world that was now his birthright. Ilara turned to Kaelan, her fear finally giving way to a wave of weary defiance. "Safe from what? Your people? Or from you?" His expression did not change, but a muscle tightened in his jaw. "My people have not seen a child within these walls in 1,000 years. They have never seen a child such as him. They are curious. It is my place to ensure that curiosity remains respectful. And you," she pressed, her voice trembling slightly. "What do you see when you look at him?" He was silent for a long time, his gaze fixed on the small boy silhouetted against the vast, dark window. The fire crackled, filling the space between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, stripped of its royal authority, raw with an emotion she could not name. "I see a miracle," he said softly. "And an impossibility. I see my own eyes looking back at me from a face that will one day see the sunrise. I see a future I never thought could exist." He finally met her gaze, and for a fleeting moment, the king was gone, and she saw only the lonely man from the festival. "I do not know what I am to him, or to you. I only know that he is my blood. And I will not fail him." He bowed his head slightly, a gesture of respect so profound and unexpected it stole her breath. Then, as silently as he had arrived on her doorstep, he turned and was gone, the heavy door closing with a soft, definitive click, leaving Ilara and her son alone in the heart of the night, surrounded by a terrifying luxury, under the protection of a king who was also a stranger, a father who was also a monster. The silence he left behind was different from the one in his study. It was not empty. It was filled with the terrifying, exhilarating weight of a new beginning. The first few weeks in the citadel were a study in gilded isolation. Ilara and Liam were ghosts haunting a palace of immortals. They were given everything they could possibly need: fine clothes, exquisite food she barely touched, toys for Liam carved from ivory and inlaid with pearl. But they were utterly alone. Servants, silent and pale, would appear to deliver meals or fresh linen, their eyes never quite meeting hers, their movements swift and noiseless. They were spectres of service, their deference a cold wall she could not breach. The court itself was a sea of beautiful, predatory faces. On the rare occasions she was escorted through the grand halls, she felt their eyes on her. The whispers followed her like the rustle of dry leaves, a sibilant chorus of disbelief and disdain. The mortal. The human pet. Look at the abomination she bore. They did not see a child, they saw a contamination, a stain on a lineage that stretched back to the dawn of night. She was a curiosity at best, a threat at worst. She learned to keep her eyes down, her back straight, to project a calm she did not feel, wrapping herself in a fragile armor of dignity. Kaelan remained a distant, powerful presence. He did not visit their chambers again. He was consumed by the political firestorm his son's arrival had ignited. She would sometimes see him from her window, a dark figure crossing a distant courtyard or standing on a high balcony, the weight of his kingdom visible in the set of his shoulders. He had claimed them, but he had not joined them. He was keeping his world and hers separate, a king managing a crisis, not a father embracing a family. The loneliness was a physical ache, a cold stone in her chest. She missed the sun. She missed the scent of damp earth and the sound of birdsong. She missed the simple, uncomplicated world she had left behind, even with its dangers. Here, the danger was subtle, cloaked in velvet and spoken in polite, venomous tones. Her only solace was Liam. In this cold, sterile environment, he was a small, vibrant spark of life. He was not afraid. The vast, echoing halls did not intimidate him. The cold, staring courtiers did not faze him. He explored their chambers with a fearless curiosity, his small hands tracing the patterns on the tapestries, his laughter a sound so alien in these ancient halls it felt like a kind of magic. One evening, unable to bear the confines of their rooms any longer, Elara slipped out into the adjoining walled garden. It was a place of stark, monochrome beauty, silver-leafed trees, night-blooming flowers the color of bone, and a black marble fountain that whispered water into a placid pool. Liam was asleep, and the stillness of the garden felt like a balm. She was not alone for long. "The air is colder up here, is it not?" The voice, smooth as chilled wine, came from the shadows. A tall, elegant vampire stepped forward, his hair the color of spun silver, his eyes a pale, piercing gray. He was handsome in the way of a perfectly sculpted ice statue, and his smile did not reach his eyes. She recognized him from the court, Lord Valerus, one of the king's oldest and most influential advisors. "My lord," she said, inclining her head, her heart beginning to beat a little faster. "Please," he said, gesturing with a graceful hand. "There is no need for such formality between us." He moved to stand beside her, his gaze sweeping over the garden. "A stark beauty, this place. But it lacks the vibrancy of the mortal world. The color, the warmth. You must miss it." It was a simple observation, but it felt like a scalpel, expertly probing a wound. "My son is safe here," she replied, her voice steady. "That is all that matters." Valerus's smile tightened. "Ah, yes. The child. A remarkable creature." The subject of endless debate in the council chambers, he turned to face her, his grey eyes pinning her in place. "The king has staked his reign on this experiment. He believes the child is a bridge between our worlds. A new future." He paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. "Many of us, however, see not a bridge, but a breach. A weakness. A dilution of our bloodline that has remained pure for 10,000 years." The polite veneer was gone. This was the naked truth of her position here. She was a contamination. "He is the king's son," she said, her voice low and fierce. "He is a king's mistake," Valerus corrected softly. "And mistakes have a way of needing to be rectified. For the good of the kingdom." Of course his gaze was cold, clear, and utterly merciless. It was a threat, delivered with the poise of a courtier and the finality of an executioner. "You are a clever woman, I think. You must see the instability of your position. A word of advice: a cage, no matter how gilded, is still a cage. And its door can be opened from either side." He bowed, the gesture a mockery of respect, and melted back into the shadows, leaving Elara shivering in the cold night air, the fountain's whisper now sounding like the hiss of a serpent. That night, she did not sleep. She sat in a chair by Liam's bed, watching the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing. Valerus's words echoed in her mind. A mistake that needs to be rectified. She had brought her son here for safety, but she had only traded a mob with torches for assassins in velvet. The door to their chambers opened without a sound. Her head snapped up, her body tensing, ready to fight, to scream, to die. It was Kalen. He stood on the threshold, his face etched with exhaustion. The weight of his argument with the council, with Valerus, was written in the lines around his eyes. He looked at her, then at the sleeping child, and something in his expression softened, the hard mask of the king cracking for the second time. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I heard you spoke with Valerus." It wasn't a question. He knew. Of course he knew. He knew everything that happened within these walls. "He believes my son is a mistake," she said, her voice flat. "Valerus is a creature of the past," Kalen said, his voice a low rumble. "He fears change because he has not had to endure it for millennia. He is wrong." He crossed the room and, for the first time since their arrival, he came to her. He did not stop at a polite distance but stood beside her chair, looking down at Liam. The child's face was serene in sleep, one small hand curled on the velvet blanket. "He has your hands," Kalen said softly, a note of wonder in his voice. "The shape of them." It was such a simple, human observation. A father's observation. It shattered the tension in the room. Elara felt the fight go out of her, replaced by a profound weariness. "I am afraid," she whispered, the admission costing her dearly. Kalen knelt. The motion was so unexpected, so contrary to his royal bearing, that she flinched. He knelt beside her chair, bringing his face level with hers. His dark eyes, no longer holding the abyss of a king's power, were filled with a raw, struggling emotion. "So am I," he confessed, the words a ghost of a sound. "I have faced armies. I have ended bloodlines. I have commanded the night for centuries. I have never known fear. But when I look at him, when I think of the world he must navigate, of the enemies he will face, both human and vampire, I am afraid. He reached out, not for her, but for his son. He gently took Liam's small hand in his own, his long, pale fingers dwarfing the child's. It was a gesture of infinite tenderness, a silent promise being made. Elara watched them, father and son, connected by that simple touch. And in that moment, she understood. He had kept his distance not out of indifference, but out of that same fear. The fear of this new, terrifying, overwhelming love. The fear of failing the one person who represented a future he'd never dared to imagine. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He finally looked at her, his gaze direct and intense. He was still holding Liam's hand. "We do not hide," he said, a new and hard resolve in his voice. "I have kept you here, separate, to protect you. I see now that was a mistake. Isolation is not safety. I will not have my son live as a secret. He is the prince of this court. It is time the court remembered that." He stood, his presence once again filling the room, but this time it was not oppressive. It was protective. It was the strength of a king, now wielded for the love of a father. He had made a decision. The time for observation was over. The battle for his son's future had just begun. The following evening, Kaelin sent for them. Not to their private chambers, but to the heart of the citadel, the obsidian throne room. A summons, Elara knew, had been sent to every noble of the court. A formal convocation. Her blood ran cold. This was it. Kaelin was forcing the issue, drawing a line in the ancient stone of his hall. A handmaiden, a young vampire with nervous eyes, helped her dress in a gown of deep blue velvet that Kaelin had sent. It was beautiful, but it felt like armor. She dressed Liam in a small tunic of the same material. He looked like a miniature lord, his dark hair combed, his solemn face a perfect, tiny replica of his father's. He seemed to sense the gravity of the evening, his usual boisterous energy replaced by a quiet, watchful stillness. As they walked through the grand corridors, flanked by two of the king's personal guard, the silence was heavy, expectant. The eyes that followed them were no longer merely curious or disdainful, they were sharp with anticipation. They were walking towards a confrontation, and she and her son were the cause. The doors to the throne room were massive, wrought from black iron in the shape of intertwined serpents. They swung open without a sound, revealing the cavernous space within. The room was a masterpiece of intimidating grandeur. The walls were polished obsidian, reflecting the cold, unwavering light of 1,000 enchanted crystals suspended from the vaulted ceiling like captured stars. Banners bearing the sigils of the ancient vampire houses hung between soaring archways. And at the far end of the long hall, upon a dais of 7 black marble steps, sat the throne itself, carved from a single, massive geode, its interior glittering with dark, crystalline facets. The court was assembled. Hundreds of immortals, dressed in their finest silks and velvets, stood in silent rows. They were a gallery of ageless, predatory beauty, their combined presence a crushing weight. At their head, standing near the foot of the dais, was Lord Valerus, his silver hair gleaming, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He looked like a man who believed he was about to witness a victory. Kaelin sat on the throne. He was not lounging. He sat ramrod straight, a figure of absolute, uncompromising power. He wore the crown of his ancestors, a circlet of jagged black metal that seemed to pull the light from the room. His eyes, dark and unreadable, swept over the assembled nobles before finding Elara and Liam at the entrance. He lifted a hand, a silent command. "Bring them forward." The guards fell away. Elara took a breath, took Liam's small hand in hers, and began the long walk down the center of the hall. It was the most terrifying walk of her life. Every step felt like a mile. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft scuff of her slippers on the marble floor. She could feel hundreds of ancient eyes dissecting her, judging her, wishing her gone. She kept her gaze fixed on Kaelin, the one point of stillness in a swirling sea of hostility. Liam did not falter. He walked beside her, his small head held high, his expression serious. He was not intimidated. He was a prince walking into his father's court. They reached the foot of the dais and stopped. Ilara curtsied, a gesture she had practiced, feeling clumsy and mortal. She stood before the throne, her son at her side, facing the full, collected power of the Vesperine court. "My lords," Kaelin's voice boomed, amplified by the acoustics of the hall. "You have been summoned to bear witness." Valerus stepped forward, his voice a silken, venomous counterpoint. "Your Majesty, you have been a wise and judicious ruler for 600 years. We, your loyal council, have advised you against this public display. The presence of the mortal and her issue in this sacred hall is an affront to our traditions. Your counsel has been noted, Valerus," Kaelin said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "As has your disloyalty." A collective gasp, sharp and sudden, rippled through the court. Valerus's composure finally cracked, a flicker of outrage in his pale eyes. "It is not disloyalty to protect the purity of our race," he retorted, his voice rising. "It is not disloyalty to question the wisdom of acknowledging a half-blooded creature as a potential heir. He is a weakness, a mongrel, a stain on your legacy." Kaelin did not move from his throne. He did not raise his voice. He simply let the silence that followed Valerus's outburst stretch, becoming more and more damning. He let the court absorb the full measure of the insult. "He is not a stain," Kaelin said finally, his voice soft but carrying to every corner of the hall. "He is not a weakness. He is my son." He rose from the throne. The movement was slow, deliberate, majestic. He descended the 7 steps of the dais, each step a resonant beat, like a drum marking a changing of an age. He did not stop at the bottom. He walked directly to Ilara and Liam. He knelt. Again, the gasp from the court was louder, a sound of pure shock. A king did not kneel. Not to anyone. Not for any reason. He knelt before his son. He looked not at the court, not at Valerus, but into the wide, dark eyes of the child. "Liam," he said, his voice for the boy's ears alone, yet it was so quiet the entire court strained to hear it. "My son." Then he looked up at Ilara, and his eyes held a universe of apology, of regret, and of promise. He reached out and took her hand, the one not holding Liam's, his cool fingers lacing with her warm ones. He stood, pulling her and Liam a step closer, so they stood together as one. He turned to face his court, Ilara's hand held firmly in his son standing before him. "A family." "You speak of purity, Valerus," Kaelin said, his voice ringing with a power no one had heard him use in centuries. "Our race is dying. We do not change. We do not grow. We are a long, slow twilight, fading into an eternal night of our own making. We cling to purity while the world moves on without us." He raised their joined hands. "This woman, this mortal, has more courage than any of you. She came here, to the heart of her fear, for the love of her child." He then placed his other hand on Liam's head, a gesture of paternal blessing and absolute claim. "And this child is not a dilution. He is a new beginning. He carries my blood, but he also carries the warmth of the sun in his. He is proof that we are not a dead end. He is hope." He looked directly at Valerus, his eyes blazing with the fire of a king's wrath. "He is the future of this house. He is Prince Liam of the Vesperine court. And you will all kneel to him. You will kneel to your prince." It was an order, absolute and final. The power that rolled off him was a physical wave, pressing down on the assembled nobles. For a heart-stopping moment, no one moved. The rebellion hung in the air, a fragile, glittering thing. Valerus stood his ground, his face a mask of defiant fury. Then, one of the oldest lords, a vampire from a house almost as ancient as Kaelin's, slowly, stiffly, went to one knee. Then another. And another. Like a wave, the obeisance spread through the hall. Soon, the entire court was kneeling. All except one. Valerus remained standing, a solitary pillar of defiance. "I will not," he hissed. "I will not kneel to a half-breed." "I did not expect you would," Kaelin said, his voice utterly devoid of emotion. "Your time, and the time of your beliefs, is over." He made a small, sharp gesture to his guard. "Lord Valerus is to be escorted to the sunless cells. He will remain there, to contemplate his traditions in solitude, for the next 500 years. Valerus's face contorted in a snarl of rage as the guards seized him. He opened his mouth to curse the king, But Kaelin simply raised a hand, and Valerus was silenced, his throat working uselessly. He was dragged from the hall, his furious, impotent gaze fixed on the king, the mortal, and the child who had undone him. Kaelin watched him go. Then he turned his attention back to his kneeling court. "Rise," he commanded. "Rise and welcome your new prince." The court rose, their faces a mixture of fear, awe, and a grudging, dawning respect. Kaelin kept hold of Alara's hand, a silent, public declaration of her new status. She was not his consort, not his queen, but she was the mother of his heir, and she stood under his absolute, unwavering protection. He looked down at Liam. The boy had watched the entire proceeding with his unnerving, solemn calm. But now, as his father's gaze met his, a small, slow smile spread across his face for the first time. It was a smile of pure, uncomplicated love. And Kaelin, the ancient king who had forgotten how, smiled back. The great, cold hall, for the first time in its long history, was filled with a flicker of warmth. The aftermath of the convocation was not a quiet settling, but the slow, grinding shift of a tectonic plate. The old order had been fractured, and a new one was being forged in the uncertain twilight. Valerus's removal sent a clear, brutal message through the court. The king's word was law, and his son was sacrosanct. The open hostility towards Alara and Liam vanished, replaced by a careful, watchful deference. They were no longer a mortal and her unnatural offspring, they were the prince's mother and the prince, titles that carried the unassailable weight of Kaelin's authority. But a change in title was not a change of heart. Alara knew that beneath the veneer of obedience, resentment still simmered in the court's ancient veins. She and Liam were still other, still a disruption. The safety Kaelin had won for them was a fortress built on his power alone. It was not the same as acceptance. The true change was in Kaelin himself. The public declaration in the throne room had been a turning point, a commitment from which he could not retreat. He no longer kept his distance. He began to weave himself into the fabric of their small, two-person world. He would appear in their chambers in the evenings, after his duties were done. At first, his visits were stiff, formal. He would stand by the hearth, inquiring after Liam's day with the awkward gravity of a monarch conducting a state visit. But Liam, with the simple, disarming honesty of a child, began to break through the royal facade. One evening, Liam toddled up to his father, holding a small wooden horse. He held it up, his expression expectant. Kaelin stared at the toy as if it were a foreign artifact. "He wants you to play," Alara said softly from her chair, a book open in her lap. Kaelin looked from the horse to his son, a flicker of panic in his ancient eyes. He had negotiated treaties, commanded armies, ruled for 6 centuries. He had no idea how to play with a wooden horse. He slowly, hesitantly, knelt down, his fine black tunic pooling on the floor. He took the horse from Liam's outstretched hand. "What does it do?" the king of the Vesperine court asked, his voice hushed. Liam giggled, a bright, startling sound. He took the horse back, made a galloping motion with it on the rug, and produced a series of enthusiastic, nonsensical noises. Kaelin watched, his expression a mixture of profound confusion and utter fascination. Slowly, he mirrored the action, his movements still too graceful, too controlled, but it was an attempt. An effort. Alara watched them, a small, painful knot of hope tightening in her chest. These were the moments that mattered more than any royal decree. The sight of the ageless, powerful king on his hands and knees on the floor, learning how to play from his toddler son, was more potent than any display of power in the throne room. Their conversations began to change, too. They spoke of Liam, of the first word he was close to forming, of his strange aversion to sweetened milk, of the way he seemed to listen to the wind. And from there, they began to speak of other things. He asked her about Oakhaven, about her life before him. He listened with an unnerving stillness as she spoke of weaving, of the changing seasons, of the simple pleasures of a world he had long ago left behind. In turn, she began to see past the king. She saw the immense burden of his long life, the weight of memories that would have crushed a mortal mind. She learned that his stillness was a form of control, a way to manage the grief and rage and loss of centuries. She saw the man he had been before the crown, and the man he was struggling to become now. One night, as Liam slept soundly in his bed, they sat by the fire, a comfortable silence between them. He will never be able to live in your world, Kaelin said, his gaze fixed on the flames. And he can never truly be a part of mine. He will walk between them, belonging to neither. Then we will have to make a world for him, Elara replied quietly. Kaelin turned to look at her, his dark eyes searching her face in the firelight. You are not a prisoner here, Elara. Valerus was right about one thing. The door to the cage can be opened. You could take him, return to the sunlight. I would not stop you. I would ensure your safety, from a distance. It was an offer. A gift. A chance to reclaim the life she had lost. She thought of the sun on her face, the smell of rain on soil, the easy company of her own kind. It was a powerful lure. But then she thought of this strange, beautiful, terrifying life. She thought of Liam, who would always be an outsider in the mortal world, his gifts a source of fear. And she thought of Kaelin, the lonely king learning to be a father. He was part of their world now, whether he knew it or not. And what of you? She asked. Would you go back to your silence? To your long, unchanging nights? He had no answer. The question hung in the air between them. His world is not one place or another, Elara said, her voice finding a strength she didn't know she possessed. His world is us. You and me. As long as he has us, he will belong. Kaelin looked at her for a long, heart-stopping moment. He saw not the frightened villager he'd collected from a cottage, but a woman of quiet, formidable strength. A queen in all but name. He reached across the space between them and, for the first time, he took her hand not as a king making a public statement, but as a man seeking connection. His touch was cool, but it sent a shock of warmth through her. Stay, he whispered. It was not a command. It was a plea. I will, she answered. Months bled into a year. Liam grew, and the citadel of night, which had not changed in millennia, began to change around him. The sound of a child's laughter echoed in halls that had only ever known whispers. Toys were sometimes left in solemn council chambers. The court, following their king's lead, began to unbend. The prince was a strange and wondrous creature, a bridge to a world they had only ever seen as prey. They began to see him not as a contamination, but as Kaelin did, as a hope. The resolution was not a grand, final victory, but a quiet accumulation of moments, a slow, patient weaving of a new reality. The new normal was a king who spent an hour every evening on the floor of his son's nursery. It was a mortal woman who advised the ruler of the night on matters of the heart he had long since forgotten. It was a family, impossible and strange, forged in the twilight between two worlds. One evening, nearly 2 years after the letter had first arrived, Kaelin took Elara and Liam to the highest tower of the citadel. A place he had not visited in centuries. It was an open-air observatory, a round platform of polished marble surrounded by a low wall, open to the vast, star-dusted sky. The air was thin and bitingly cold, but Kaelin stood behind Elara, his tall frame shielding her from the worst of the wind. He had wrapped Liam in a heavy, fur-lined cloak, and the boy was a small, warm bundle in his arms. Look, Kaelin said, his voice a low murmur against her hair. He pointed towards the eastern horizon. Beyond their jagged kingdom of black mountains, the sky was beginning to change. A faint, pearlescent line was appearing, a slow bleed of pale violet and soft grey into the inky blackness. It was the dawn. The enemy. The fire that had confined him to the shadows for his entire existence. Elara felt him tense behind her, an instinctual recoil from the approaching light. But he did not move away. He held his ground. Liam, however, was not afraid. He wriggled in his father's arms, pointing a small, mittened hand towards the growing light. Pity, he said, one of his first clear words. Pretty. Kaelin looked down at his son, then back at the horizon, where the light was now turning a soft, promising rose. He could feel the first faint touch of its power, a warning tingle on his skin. It was a pain he had not felt in centuries. But it was not just pain. With his son in his arms and the boy's mother shielded by his own body, he watched the dawn. He watched as the first, brilliant, golden ray of sun crested the distant mountains. It struck the peaks of his dark kingdom, setting them ablaze with a light they had not known for an age. He had to turn his face away, his eyes closing against the searing beauty of it. But he did not retreat into the shadows. He stood his ground on the edge of the night, holding his family, and endured the coming of the day. He was a creature of darkness, a king of twilight. But his son, his impossible, miraculous son, was a child of the dawn. And Kaelin would not fail him. He would learn to stand in the light.